Well, I'm sure most of you know that I'm David Haigh, founder and chairman of Brand Finance PLC. Thank you all for coming. It was really quite a schlep to get here, actually. I didn't realise quite how far it was from Waterloo, and I got rather hot. But this is a great venue, and I told them to turn the air conditioning down, so you should be all right. We've got a great audience here, and the thought just occurred to me that at the moment, I'm not quite sure where or if we're going to call for audience questions, but if I can, I will try and include that in my fireside with Mark. What we're going to do today is to launch our 2026 ranking of the strongest and most valuable 250 most valuable and strongest UK brands. I don't think we've got hard copies, but we've got a little thing with a QR code on it. I looked at it earlier. It's quite interesting, actually. I hadn't looked at them for a while. What's going on with UK brands is a fascinating story. One assumes that many of them are doing badly, but in fact, that isn't necessarily the case. We're also going to discuss the importance of trust in building brand value and how CMOs can contribute to that. And finally, I'm going to chat with Mark, who's the founder of the mini MBA company, but I'm sure you all know, and that's probably why most of you are here. So see if you've got any interesting questions you might want to ask him. I set up Brand Finance 30 years ago this year. And by the way, I don't normally read scripts, but I promised Annie I would not drivel on, which I quite often do. So I've got to try and keep it to 10 minutes. So I'm doing a script today. I set up Brand Finance 30 years ago this year and was previously CFO of various companies, but latterly the global brand valuation director of Interbrand. I was just saying to James Welchman, actually, that getting into being a CFO was a bit of an accident because I was really an arts graduate and read English at university, and really I was a bit of an arty person. But my Scottish stepfather and my mother both said that I could not live in their flat in Fulham unless I got a real job, and marketing and advertising didn't count. So I had to choose a profession, and the best of the bad choices was to become an accountant, which actually turned out quite interesting because you learn a lot about business. But I fairly rapidly then moved into becoming a finance director of ad agencies, and that led me on into becoming knowing about marketing and doing brand valuation. So that's my history. Now, unfortunately, I was a bit unhappy with various aspects of the role at Interbrand. And the purpose of this is not really to put the boot in on Interbrand. I know them well, I love them. John Murphy was a great bloke. He was a great entrepreneur, and he more or less invented modern brand valuation and makes a big joke out of it and says he worked it out on his kitchen table because he pitched to a client, said he could do a brand valuation when they'd never done one before, so he had to work it out over the weekend. So the tendency was for it to be quite a shoot from the hip. And several of the technical issues that he had shot from the hip on weren't very satisfactory. So first of all, the contribution of brand to the business, which Interbrand referred to as the role of branding index, was based on largely subjective judgment by John and other self-proclaimed brand experts, rather than on objective research. And that I always used to find it difficult when I went in to see clients, particularly the finance clients. And secondly, the cost of capital that they used in the valuation, which is a key number, was based on a very black box approach, which they called the S-curve. It just went like that, and you picked a discount rate off it. It had no real merit, and they should have been using the capital asset pricing model, which is the common method for determining the discount rate you use in calculations. The calculated brand value was not sense-checked against the value of the branded business as a whole. So in other words, the sensible thing to do is you value the business and then you value the brand and say, does it make sense in the context of that business? I remember at least 2 occasions where we actually valued the brand and the client challenged us, the client CFO challenged us in the meeting and said, well, hang on, your brand value is higher than what we think the enterprise value is. How does that work? And how do you answer that question? Not very easy. And so right from day one, we have always had the view that you should value the branded business as a whole and then value the brand and see it in the context of it. And then that automatically says you've got to look at the other intangibles as well, which is why we rabbit on about other intangibles like patents and so on. And all of that, there was one other thing that I didn't like, which was that most of the clients that we did this for were creative clients of Interbrand. So you're sort of marking your own homework, which I also found very unsatisfactory. And that all led to skepticism amongst CFOs who found the opaqueness and lack of transparency pretty unsatisfactory, all of which I didn't like being part of. That's one of the primary reasons that I left and set up Brand Finance, to try and address all these concerns in what I thought we should be. So Brand Finance was then, and remains today, the world's leading independent brand valuation firm. Now, at the time, it was an easy claim, because apart from Interbrand, there were no others. So for me to say we were the leading independent one was a fairly easy, substantiable claim. There are a lot more of them today, but we still maintain our view that we are the leading one. And our mission is to bridge the gap between marketing and finance. I think you probably know from the sign. We measure, analyze, evaluate brands and branded businesses, as I've said, but we don't do creative execution work of any kind. That's always been our rule. We don't do that. I occasionally come up with cheesy brand names when clients say, can you think of a brand name? But they're nearly always poo-pooed, so I stay away from all that. Our database of brand equity and brand value, on the other hand, is widely used by the World Intellectual Property Organization, and they distribute it to the 193 countries in the UN by several investment indices who use our data to determine their indices, and many individual clients who use it for strategy and financial reporting. We consciously designed our brand valuation approach to appeal to skeptical CFOs. And in fact, the method that we use for the table that I just mentioned is specifically the one that is always used by financial audiences, whether tax, accounting, or whatever, for their purposes. And that's why we chose it. There are other methods which are explained in the ISO, but the one that finance directors prefer is the one that we use here. And we consciously designed our brand valuation approach to appeal to skeptical CFOs who need to be won over by CMOs. There's no question of that, it's fairly obvious. So to this end, I have spent, this is me being pompous now, I've spent 3 decades pioneering transparent brand valuation standards. And at the moment, I am the chairman of the Global Technical Committee 289 of the ISO. You may never have heard of ISO 10668, but that was passed in 2010 as the global standard in brand valuation. And in the new year, the revised version of that is going to be launched. So watch this space. It's only about 10 pages long. Don't worry, it'll send you to sleep at night, but it's very short. Key to our approach is open brand valuation standards. So if anyone wants to challenge us how we got to our number, we're always happy to explain exactly. Because of that searing experience with CFOs back when I started, where I didn't like having to say, well, I can't tell you that, that's our algorithm, or whatever we said. And you have to use these brand valuation standards rather than proprietary black boxes, and you also need to use objective data, transparency, and independence. Now, when I started, the first thing I thought I ought to do was try and explain to myself how I actually thought brands worked. And so back in 1996, the very first thing I did was to sit down and try and work it out. Now, one critical issue that arose from that is that all brands, brands influence all stakeholders, not just customers. That was not a particularly widely held view back in 1996, when brands were generally thought to be for customers only, and largely in the FMCG space. We made the point back then, or I made the point back then, that stakeholder groups should be divided into those that directly affect the profit and loss of the branded business, and those that indirectly influence the profit and loss. We focus most of our effort when we're doing our analysis on understanding the former group, but we're also interested in the other group. They're influential, but don't directly influence the economic outcome. Direct shareholders, stakeholders, I beg your pardon, include customers, staff, business partners, and financiers, and each one has favourable effects on either revenues or costs. And that's a bit of a cliche, everyone said all that. But there's been lots and lots of research on each of these, like the fact that people work for you for longer at lower salaries, the fact that financiers will lend you money cheaper, the fact that you get more customers, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the most important stakeholder by far is customers or consumers who are critical to the generation, maintenance, and growth of profitable revenues. And thinking about how the brand can get more from its target customers, we inevitably have to consider the marketing funnel. Businesses have to make as many relevant customers as possible aware of and familiar with their brands. And this requires distinctive and well-resourced communications. That's fairly obvious to me. But we then have to convert that familiarity into consideration, choice, trial, preference, and finally advocacy. In our view, or originally my view, but I hope all my colleagues agree, what makes this happen is superior performance on the optimal mix of functional, emotional, and societal attributes. Every industry has a different balance that's important. Every brand focuses on a different balance, which is important to them, and they are trying to identify which attributes and what mix of attributes are most important to customers or potential customers in the specific marketplace and segmented by target group. When we evaluate a brand, we have to research which attributes matter most to the target customers, and brands need to strengthen the attributes which matter most to them. We measure brand performance with quantitative market research, and this is the point that I was making about back when I started. I didn't like the fact we didn't use quantitative or even much research at all, and statistical analysis of various different types, which we use to better forecast the revenues and projections in the future. If CMOs want to strengthen their brands and increase market share and brand value, they need to focus on the attributes which matter most to customers. And on this point, I just now want to address a couple of hot topics, which I think Mark goes on about. The first one is Byron Sharp's contention, expressed in How Brands Grow, that it isn't necessary to be differentiated from other brands, but it is necessary to be distinctive. As I've already said, all brands need to be distinctive if they can, but I disagree with him in his view on differentiation, which flies against everything I have seen and heard while looking at brands and valuing them in all kinds of sectors over the last 40 years or whatever it is. The reason we research and analyze brand attributes and relative performance of them is specifically to emphasize those attributes which matter most to customers and then engineer better performance on the most important attributes. Seems obvious to me. This automatically and inevitably creates meaningful differentiation between brands and shifts brand preferences. And to say that it doesn't matter, to me, is patently ridiculous. His view that size and mental and physical availability and broad targeting are more important than differentiation may possibly be right when considering undifferentiated consumer packaged goods sold in supermarkets with a split-second decision. But I don't think it is true in many of the sectors that we talk about, B2B, technical, professional services, medical, etc. It just doesn't make sense, particularly because very often the decision is more complicated than one person. And the second point is Daniel Kahneman's theory in Thinking Fast and Slow, that our brains have a system one mechanism, which is unconscious, automatic, quick, intuitive, but error-prone, and a system two mechanism, which is conscious, slow, complex, rational, but reliable. Because of his work, there are quite a few people who say that all brand decisions are actually based on system one, the implication being forget about traditional research and all that attribute analysis stuff. Again, I don't think that is true. However, my understanding is that Kahneman actually believed that the two systems work in tandem so that individual decisions generally involve both systems. Otherwise, why did evolution develop both systems? It doesn't make sense otherwise, doesn't it? Well, not to me anyway. It seems to me that many brand decisions made by different stakeholders are made after consultation with other brand users or relevant parties, or they're too complicated to make on a split-second decision. And if you read the background on his theories, it seems to me that he acknowledges that. And so system one gets defeated by that complexity and enlists the support of system two so that you get both in the decision. It may be that system one pushes for quick decisions, but system two restrains it, moderates it, particularly in B2B, in frequent purchases, and specific brand situations. That's my view, anyway. So we can argue about that if you like later. So the next question is, what have reputation and trust got to do with it anyway? Over the years, since we developed our brand model, reputation became a popular concept. Reputation Institute, who we know quite well, plugged that idea for ages. Our view is that brands require a reputation for good or bad performance against those specific attributes, but also an overall good or bad reputation in aggregate, which affects customer preference. So you summarize it all into one reputation, which may lead to your preference changing. But reputation is based on actual past performance on the attributes. Recently, trust has become all trendy and has become a popular concept. Brands have to be trusted by customers. It seems to me obvious, they have to be trusted to maintain the expected standard of performance on specific attributes and in aggregate but the key question is, in the future, they trust that it will be that in the future and to maintain their choice and their loyalty. Reputation is therefore a backward-looking measure, while trust is a forward-looking measure, to me. But I don't believe the mechanism is much different from the one we developed 30 years ago to explain brand preference. It's just largely terminological. This is more or less my last slide. Does reputation and brand change, or do reputation and brand change over time? You'll see here that, in our view, there are kind of three scenarios. The first one, with a completely new brand, is that, following my argument, you can't have a reputation because you're brand new. So you can't have a historical reputation. However, I think that what happens is that people trust the founders, creators, or whatever from their past experience, and that creates the trust which allows people to buy. And if those people are not credible enough and reputable enough, very often you don't get the trust and new brands flop. That seems like a sensible conclusion. But once established, a brand seeks to achieve a virtuous circle and they feed on one another and keep going. Sometimes, however, performance may drop for whatever reason, so reputation and trust spiral downwards, damaging the value of the brand. In our view, reputation is certainly in my view, reputation is a backward-looking measure of individual and aggregate performance, while trust is a forward-looking belief that the individual and aggregate performance of the brand will remain strong and justify brand choice and support brand value. So my last slide is just the impact of all of that. This is a chart which shows our AAA brands compared against the S&P 500 and against the MSCI World Index. It demonstrates that AAA brands from our database, the companies that own them are significant, well, not necessarily significantly, but they do outperform the other two measures, which are key benchmarks of the investment industry. And you can see on the left there, substantially improved return on equity, operating margin, and so on. The Global Brand Index, used by Legal & General in its Global Brand ETF, which was launched a couple of years ago, is based on this analysis, based on AAA brands rated by us, with back testing to demonstrate the connection. I'm not allowed to say much about that, but the fact that it was even chosen, I think, demonstrates that what we are doing is quite robust. With that, I'm going to stop. I just wanted everyone to know what my view was about all of this, so that when I get into talking with Mark, it is clear. And I'm now going to hand to Annie, who's going to tell us more about trust. Thank you.